Welcome, everyone. Glad to see you here tonight and appreciate your interest in both climate and climate justice issues and our election that we are having for mayor, a very important election for the city of Boston. So I would like to start briefly by introducing the candidates. So we have Andrea Campbell, who is a city councilor, and Michelle Wu, who is also a city councilor, Annissa Essaibl-George, who is also a city councilor, John Barros is the former head of economic development for the city of Boston, and Jon Santiago, who is the state representative for the South End. So thank you very much, candidates, for joining us. All of you will probably notice that there is a candidate who is not here, and you should feel free to draw your own conclusions from that, because I don't really know why, but they chose not to participate. So I think what we're going to do first is to hear from each of you candidates, 2 minutes each. And we will start with alphabetical order by their last name. So John Barros.
Thank you, Bob. I want to thank 350 and all of the partnering organizations, Sierra Club and other organizations, for hosting this conversation tonight and for inviting me to it. And I'm happy to participate. For me, climate justice, environmental justice started at a very early age. Born and raised in Roxbury, Dorchester. I became a community organizer at a very young age, and it was all about environmental justice. In fact, my first organizing effort was to help do a neighborhood cleanup, because it's so important. In fact, living in a neighborhood where we had the highest rate of asthma, the highest rate of trash transfer stations, of uses that were bad for our health, we needed to take action. Climate action is about protecting the health and safety of our people, our children, our families. It's about cutting emissions and preparing for the impact of climate change, particularly for the communities that are most urgent. It's about making sure that they're not displaced and gentrified because of the extremities that we're expecting in climate. Past few summers, we've seen some of the hottest on record. The heat waves have been brutal. And in my neighborhood, some of the elders have really paid a consequence because of the lack of AC or less parks, trees, greens. So as mayor, I'll accelerate Boston's commitment to becoming carbon neutral. I will also set stronger carbon reduction standards for private businesses and large buildings, and strengthen Boston's community choice energy program. I'll expand our public transit and bike infrastructure, plant more trees, and improve the quality for all Bostonians, particularly the neighborhoods like the ones that I live in. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Next, Andrea.
Thank you, Bob. And of course, thank you to all of the host organizations. There are several of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to plan a space for us to be able to participate and talk about pressing issues related to the climate and of course the environment. I also want to thank those folks on the Zoom, and the numbers are going up, for taking time out of your busy schedule to be a part of the conversation tonight. Of course, I look forward to answering your questions. I'm Andrea Campbell. I'm currently on the City Council, as Bob has mentioned. I currently represent District 4, which is largely Dorchester, Mattapan, a little bit of Jamaica Plain, and Rosendale. I've been on the council for the last 6 years, representing and working in partnership with my residents and civic leaders on a whole host of issues. Improving Boston public schools, economic opportunity, of course, issues of climate, housing, the environment, so many issues, always with the goal of making sure that the systems that provide all of these services are transparent, equitable, just, and accountable to the residents we have the honor and privilege of serving in the city of Boston. I got into this work after losing my twin brother, Andre, who I talk about all the time. We both grew up in Boston. We were born and raised in the South End. We're both Boston Public Schools kids. I go off to college, to law school, come back to start my legal career in Roxbury. Instead, he cycles in and out of the criminal justice system, passing away while in the custody of the Department of Correction, which oversees our prisons here in Massachusetts, when he was only 29. And the question I asked was, how did two twins born and raised in the city of Boston have such different life outcomes? That is the question. Systems reform has always been centered in my work. I know tonight's conversation is about the environment, climate, of course, but we also know that every issue is intersectional. So I look forward to talking about environmental injustice issues, climate, of course, but also the plan I've put forward that speaks directly to what I would do as mayor to solve for these issues. But also I look forward to speaking to my record of accomplishment with a whole host of these issues. I'm really proud of the fact that when I was council president, serving as the first Black woman to serve as council president, the council had the most aggressive environmental agenda and passed the most aggressive legislation we had ever in the history of the city council. That leadership would not change, it would continue, but most importantly, it would center and include communities of color that often feel left out of the conversation, and do it in such a way that it brings folks together across every single neighborhood to address issues of climate, using metrics, being intentional about centering communities of color, doing it with a sense of urgency. We have a lot of plans in the city of Boston, great plans, shiny plans. Let's implement them already. Let's invest in this work for this generation and of course, the next generations to come. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Bob.
You're welcome. Annissa.
Thanks very much, Bob, and thank you everyone for having us here this evening. Boston can lead the response on climate and climate justice. Those in leadership, those of us in leadership, have a moral obligation to be bold on climate action and fight for the future of our communities. We need a mayor who will not only start on day one to push for a more sustainable future, but who will start those conversations in our communities. I'm ready to take on that responsibility as your mayor and get to the work ahead quickly. We need to cut emissions, invest in green jobs, promoting a green economy, preparing our coastlines for sea level rise, and growing our tree canopy and green spaces equitably across every single neighborhood. More importantly, as mayor, I'll lead on climate action with a community-based approach to ensure that each and every resident has a seat at the table. And I really, really do mean everyone. Because for far too long, our frontline communities whose health and safety is most at risk has been left out of those discussions. We need to steer the conversation back to the communities across our city who are disproportionately impacted by climate. That's what I've done as your city councilor and what I'll continue to do with your mayor. Thank you for this opportunity to discuss these issues in greater detail this evening with all of you. Thank you, Bob.
You're welcome. Jon Santiago.
Great. Thank you, Bob. Thank you to 350 Sierra Club. And I think what I read was that there are about 40 plus nonprofit and advocacy groups that have come together tonight to host this forum. Again, my name is Jon Santiago. I'm the state representative of the 9th Suffolk, which South End, Roxbury, parts of Back Bay, and parts of Fenway. And I think what I appreciate most about this forum is that it exemplifies exactly what we need to be doing to face the climate crisis, right? And that means bringing together a wide swath of stakeholders, organizing them and really finding solutions to this existential threat that I think many of us on this virtual phone call would agree with, because we need a comprehensive approach if we're going to be successful, and we can't afford not to, because all what's at stake, right? And it's going to be an approach, that's focused on, listen, some of the things that have been mentioned already: environmental justice, climate resiliency, carbon neutrality, but one that also has to be centered on, racial and economic justice. And I'm proud of my record on Beacon Hill on these matters. As a state rep, I strongly advocated for and voted to pass a 2050 climate roadmap bill that was one of the most comprehensive packages in the entire country. As many of you know on this call, the bill did a couple of things. I think the three landmark things would put us on a pathway to carbon neutrality by 2050. It finally codified environmental justice, and it increased, our reliance on renewable energy. I stepped up on environmental issues in my own backyard by partnering with neighborhoods and stakeholders to really ensure that some developments were moving away from fossil fuel infrastructure. And so as mayor, I'm committed to ensuring that Boston remains a leader in climate resiliency, carbon neutrality, and environmental justice, and the green economy. And that means getting Boston to beat, our state's goal of carbon neutrality by 2050. It means addressing long-standing environmental justice issues. It means getting our climate and resiliency efforts right. And it means advancing racial and economic justice through a green economy. You know, I know we have the tools, we have the resources, and we have the people to get it done. And I want to be the mayor that does just that. So thank you, Bob.
You're welcome.
I really appreciate your convening all of us, and thank you to all of the organizations who have come together to put this incredibly important conversation together. My name is Michelle Wu. I've had the pleasure of knowing and working alongside so many of you over many years, because Boston has been leading the way on climate, and more often than not, we've had to push and fight to get it done. I bring to this work not only my official title and role as a city councilor at large, representing all of Boston for 8 years now, but my most important role and title of being a mom. The urgency of watching my 2 kids grow up in Boston and realizing that my older son's 6 years alive on this planet have been the 6 hottest years ever on record in hundreds of years of record keeping, and continue to see those records shattered. It drives me every day to work and make sure that we are being bold and doing more for progress, not just for this generation, but for generations to come. My kids have grown up in climate organizing from their very first events, Blaze, protesting the West Roxbury lateral pipeline, which never should have been built in a residential community. We did not need new fossil fuel infrastructure, to being strapped to me when we were fighting for divestment up at the State House, or pushing for community choice energy in Boston to take that single biggest step that we could have done to ramp up renewable energy sourcing. We've seen time and again that when we center young people, when we follow the lead of climate activists organizing all across the city and beyond, we can do big things in this city. Those are the lessons of the pandemic too. We've all lived through so much, watching family members struggle, grieving losses, trying to put food on the table, balancing the demands of a failed care economy as parents, and especially women of color, have been pushed out of the workforce. All of the struggles, all of the burdens, the barriers have continued to sit disproportionately on the shoulders of our environmental justice communities. The same Black, brown, immigrant families who are already bearing the burdens of exposure to air pollution prior to COVID-19, lack of transit access, housing instability, food insecurity. And so all of the challenges that we face are deeply interconnected. But the biggest lesson from the pandemic is that when we choose to take on our crises, when we choose to take action head on, we can do big, big things right at the city level. And so I'm proud to have a record of accomplishments in coalition with community, delivering wins on the fights that people told us would be impossible to get done. Many of them, I think I saw a partner here, City Councilor Matt O'Malley in the audience as well, someone who's been leading the way as chair of our climate committee on the City Council. We have seen that Boston can't wait. The answer at the end of the day as to why we didn't do something is never about resources. It's never that we couldn't figure out how to do it. It's never that we didn't have enough people ready and willing to help. It is political will. I vow as mayor that I will continue this urgency, the scale of change that we need. I'm proud to have put forward the first city level Green New Deal anywhere in the country, endorsed by Bill McKibben, Sunrise Boston, so many activists at the local and national level, because the only way we can solve our deepest challenges is by organizing together. So very excited to get to talk through all of these issues with you all tonight, and most of all, to continue democratizing our decision-making process for the vision that we deserve.
Thank you, Michelle. Sorry, I skipped over you. Yes, just the thing I wanted to mention was that this is now, there are 50 organizations across Boston that have endorsed and supported this forum. To me, when we started this out, I thought, oh, maybe we'll get 10 or 12 or whatever. I had no idea. The enthusiasm for addressing the climate and climate justice issues in the city of Boston is clearly huge. And the organizations that support it come from every corner of the city, from East Boston to the to Mattapan, and from Dorchester to Brighton and all over the city. It's an incredible array. It has been my pleasure to actually connect with all these organizations in some, at least in some minimal way. But also what I want to remind you all is, since somebody is going to be our new mayor come January, that there's a lot of people who care, and I know that you're all great advocates for this, but should you ever forget to be an advocate, there'll be a lot of people to remind you. And I think that's part of the role that communities should take on, and community organizations. So that's enough for that. So what's next is the structured questions that we have. And the first one is going to be from Corey Stallings. If you would unmute yourself, Corey, and give yourself a very brief introduction, and then ask your question if you would. And then the first person to answer the question will be John Barros.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm glad everyone is here tonight. It's such a great thing. We've been working so hard to pull this off, so I really appreciate everyone being here tonight. So just real quick about me, my name is Corey Stallings. I am the director of South Street Youth Center. I have been in the Jamaica Plain community for about 6 years now. And, proud to be in Jamaica Plain. It's been a great community. So just really quick, also have one of our youth, Grace Melendez, who will be asking the question a little bit later. Really proud that she's being a part of this. She was a part of another forum and stuff like that, so I'm really proud of her as well. So my question is this: what do you think about the proposed revision of Article 37 to require net zero buildings emissions from the buildings that are requesting zoning exceptions? Then also, what do you think? What about the net zero buildings for like smaller projects that are not covered by Article 37? And then what about net zero in Suffolk Downs at the Mass General developments? And I think John is going first.
Hey, Corey, good to see you, man. Thanks for the question, and thanks for the work that you do. I think we need to look at amendments to Article 37 that address the issues you put out. I do think, in fact, I'll start with the one that you raised around the size of projects. As you know, Article 37 is only triggered if you have an Article 80 review for large projects. And that starts us at 50,000 square feet per project. We need to make sure we're capturing the projects from 10,000 to 50,000. There are a lot of projects there that we should make sure that are doing the same Article 37 checklist around emissions, the same Article 37 checklist around heat and how to design around that, precipitation. Those are the things that need to happen. Now, you mentioned the Mass General project. It's the same thing there. We need to extend to Mass General. And then there was a third part of your question, Corey. I got those two. Help me, remind me the third part.
You're muted, Corey.
Sorry, I said it's the Mass General and also Suffolk Downs is a part of that. And you covered the other two pieces already.
Yeah, no, yeah, absolutely. Suffolk Downs needs to go through the same checklist, and Mass General does too. Let me add on to that. Here's what Article 37 needs to do as well. We need to add an environmental justice checklist to Article 37. Are you, like for something like, Suffolk Downs, are you next to an environmental justice community? What are the benefits to that community? What are the issues that we need to be addressing? How do we mitigate those issues in East Boston? We need to also address that as we look at our flood resilience overlay zoning. Those are the kinds of things that we need to amend to both things.
Great. Thank you, John. Just as a reminder before we continue, try not to go over 2 minutes if you can on response. And John, you were fine, no quarrel there, just so that we'll make sure that we get through everything. Next answer person will be Andrea.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Corey, for the work you do in community, and thank you for the question, and also thank you to Grace, who I think is with you somewhere in this virtual world. So yes, we often find that whether it's Article 37, we have regulations and policies on the books that aren't implemented fully, that are not adhered to, and we don't hold folks accountable, right? So I do think I fully support, of course, the provisions in Article 37, the spirit of Article 37. The question is, how do we actually implement and take action with respect to every project? I think the Suffolk Downs, I'm going to start in reverse order of your question. I'm going to start at the end. And Suffolk Downs, MGH, great project. Frankly, kudos to the district councilor in the area for pushing for that project to be aligned with resiliency efforts and plans by the city, and also resiliency efforts and plans by the community. That leadership is critically important. But right now what we're seeing is it's an ad hoc sort of way in which people are showing up. So whether it is a district councilor, in this case, Lydia Edwards, showing up, you got the Children's Museum, who I've met with, the aquarium, folks sort of trying to adhere to Article 7 by themselves. That's the problem. And so for me, it really is about making sure that protocols are in effect with respect to every project that comes online. Smaller projects, larger projects. Obviously, Barros just spoke to that, the importance of size not being a factor. We know that regardless of the size of the project, depending on where you're situated, what neighborhood, it can still have climate and environmental effects. So how do we make sure that every proposal that comes through the BPDA, that comes through the city, even if it goes, say, through ISD, goes through a resiliency and climate checklist, that there is someone to hold folks accountable to that, implementing what's in that checklist? In addition, how do we make sure that smaller landlords, private owners, are actually given the resources to be able to adhere to Article 37? I think that is an issue that came up quite a bit when I was developing my environmental plan, is the concern around folks who want to adhere to Article 37 or do other creative things, retrofitting, other things like that. They don't necessarily have the resources to be able to do it. I would make sure that that was taken care of in the city of Boston, that we were creative on creating funds to help smaller landlords and homeowners be able to also participate in resiliency plans in the city of Boston. Lastly, I will just say that I also think it's critically important on the flip side of this. What are the ways in which we can support those communities that we deem to be environmentally unjust communities in terms of jobs, projects that come into a particular neighborhood? Who are they contracting with? Who are they offering jobs to? How are they creating economic opportunity in the very community in which they're going into? That's a critical piece that also needs to be made a part of the conversation, and also specifically made a part of the policy in the city of Boston. I would push that if blessed to become the next elected mayor.
Thank you, Andrea. Annissa.
Thank you, Corey, for the question. And JP is grateful to have you as a resident, and what a wonderful neighborhood that you live in. As mayor, it's important to note that I will work with every city department and agency to build, remodel, and invest in green and energy efficient and sustainable infrastructure, especially when we think about our city's facilities and our city's motor vehicles and our city fleet. This has to be core regardless of any project, any effort, any plan, or any process that's undertaken. Net zero building, specifically in development, isn't as costly as most people think, and that investment, we know, quickly pays off, helping developers and building owners financially, but also certainly helping all of us environmentally. And it certainly has to be something that we're doing as a city, but always and also making sure that through the process, we've got multiple voices at the table. I'll certainly activate and leverage my role as mayor of the city when looking at the city's publicly owned infrastructure to bolster some of our longer term climate resiliency plans and visions that are currently on the books, but again, need to be activated in a much more robust way. For example, our Boston Public Schools that take up the majority and make up the majority of our city-owned buildings. We need to make sure that we're updating them and making sure that they too are going through this process, and we're being very thoughtful about those renovations and over the coming years, especially with the federal infrastructure dollars coming in, as we embark on a true build BPS, build our Boston Public Schools, rebuild our Boston Public Schools plan. We need to make sure that we are thinking very thoughtfully and specifically about our climate and resiliency, and making sure that those redevelopments are done with this front of mind. Specific to Suffolk Downs and MGH, when we have larger projects, we need to make sure that the community is also engaged in this process. And certainly a well-managed project and a well-managed project includes a plan that is done in partnership, certainly with the experts. We need the experts at the table. We need to remember that our community members, our residents, especially those in the most impacted parts of our city and our different neighborhoods, are included in all of those conversations and in that work, because they are in the end the ones that are most greatly affected and impacted. So for me, it's certainly important to our work and needs to be throughout all of the work that we do as a city. Thanks, Corey, for the question.
Thank you, Annissa. John?
Great. Corey, thank you for the question, and thank you for all what you do in your work in JP. I mean, listen, Article 37 was just a start. I mean, without a doubt, I believe it's made Boston a leader in sustainable development. And as mayor, I want to make sure that we continue that path, given all what's at stake, right? But we have to realize that, you know, I think the year Article 37 was written in 2007. I mean, let's take a second to realize where we were at in 2007 and how the debate has changed so much when it comes to climate crisis, right? You know, we need to relook and revamp Article 37, really, in terms of the technology that we're using nowadays, but also just the urgency of the climate crisis, you know? And here we are 13 years later and so much has changed. So I'm committed to retooling Article 37 to make sure it reflects today of the current times, right? And that starts off by doing a number of things. You know, I agree with what's been said on this call thus far. You know, we need to increase the purview of Article 37, you know, as was said, you know, it starts at 50,000. We really need to look at projects that are much, much smaller than that, because, you know, I don't care whatever building you create in the city of Boston, you know, you're going to impact the environment in one way or another. And we need to make sure that Article 37 and the checklist and what they're doing is you know, practiced in every type of development. You know, I really want to add and expand the role of the IGBC. You know, as you know, John and Corey, you know, there are 3 filing stages, right? And that's what the IGBC looks at, and really not just a checklist of compliance, but really has some teeth, and making sure that they are doing the work that they need to do and that they have the resources and the incentives to hold these developers you know, accountable. Because I do think accountability is an important part of this, and I'm committed to doing that as the mayor of Boston. I also think, you know, making sure that we include EJ standards as well is an important part when you look at projects like Mass General and Suffolk Downs and those communities. I mean, to me, a large project puts our city at risk for more pollution, right? So we need to make sure that those communities are at the table, that they're engaged, that they're listened to, and that we're holding them accountable. And I'm, you know, just to, you know, put an exclamation point on it, very much committed to reviewing our whole zoning code and making sure that environmental justice, climate resiliency, carbon neutrality is a part of all of it. So thank you for the question, Corey.
Thanks, John. Michelle?
Thank you, Corey. I'm glad we're starting here with this question, because building and zoning code and getting to decide who has the permissions to construct what types of development in what places and what details, that is one of the most important powers of city government. And this is also the place where we really need to get it right if we're going to reduce emissions in Boston. We know it's been documented that more than 70% of the city of Boston's carbon footprint comes from our building sector, and most of the rest of it from transportation. But that biggest chunk means between now and when we're trying to hit some incredibly important goals for reducing our emissions by 2050, we're going to have to retrofit more than 80,000 buildings in Boston to be able to stay within the limits that are necessary. And if that's already the starting point, we can't lose time in allowing new buildings to be built that are going to then have to turn around and be retrofitted right away, right? So we have to get it right from the outset. And so I fully support the net zero buildings push. Again, shout out to Councilor O'Malley, who's been leading this charge on the council. It has been a long time coming. We started with city buildings, municipal buildings, because this is where we have the fullest control, but it should not be a voluntary resiliency checklist that the BPDA administers. I'm really proud of introducing legislation in coalition with community groups to pass our wetlands protection ordinance, which is the biggest step that Boston could have taken to require green development, resiliency in our development process, because this shifted the power away from the BPDA, which was frankly doing things in a very piecemeal, voluntary resiliency checklist kind of way, over to the Conservation Commission, which has much more teeth in how they're going to require and encourage natural resource areas and green areas to be taken into account. And so when it comes to how we're building, there's no more clear example than what we've seen at the Seaport. This is an area of the city where inequities have been exacerbated, not one Black homeowner getting a mortgage, where transportation has so failed, no transportation in and out, a gondola being floated as a feasible idea to fly people out of traffic because it's so bad, and the most climate vulnerable large new construction anywhere in the country happening right in Boston. And so we cannot repeat the mistakes of the past. We need to make sure that we are planning citywide, district-wide, all facets of our resiliency, and that starts with the powers and the regulations we have right within city control. So I know it's very technical jargon. I knew when a bunch of climate groups got together, we're going to start getting down to article numbers and all that. But Article 37 is a symbol for the power we have at the city level to bring people into the process of shaping their communities around them in a way that actually protects our long term and brings opportunity for everyone.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. We did get a question in chat about Article 37. Those of us who are rather immersed in some of these things think that the whole world knows what these terms mean. So I'm going to explain it briefly. Article 37 is a zoning, an article of the city's zoning code, which is managed by the Boston Planning and Development Agency, agency these days, yes. And which is also referred to as the BPDA. The Article 37 is the article, as was mentioned, was written in 2007, that describes energy efficiency. Essentially, it wasn't really talking about climate in those days, but it did reference energy efficiency for new buildings. So there are a lot of proposals for changing that to more focus on net zero and clean energy. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, the next questioner is Lokita Jackson. Lokita, would you introduce yourself briefly and then ask your question?
Absolutely, Bob, thank you. Thank you, candidates, for joining us this evening. My name is Lokita Jackson, and I am a co-chair of the Roseberry Ruskindale Road Neighborhood Association in Hyde Park. I'm also a member of the Crane Ledge Woods Coalition. My question to you all, how do you see attacking the net zero building or housing retrofit issue? And then included in that is include the need to prevent gentrification and or displacement in retrofitted buildings. So how do you see attacking that?
Okay, Michelle, you get to go first.
Thank you, Ms. Lokita. It's good to see you again, and thank you for all of your leadership on an incredibly important community issue that we're fully going to back you on and make sure that we are getting this project right as well. When it comes to, actually, this is a great segue to the last follow-up to the last question. How are we actually going to do it, right? This is a place where we need the people power, right, the workforce, trained, equitably accessible, and then also the financing so that there are no barriers whatsoever to who's able to benefit from these kinds of improvements. And that's how to stem the displacement. So on the workforce side, I'm really excited about the opportunity that Boston has to put forward an urban conservation corps. This is a concept that other cities have seen work really well. And I've partnered with Councillor Kenzie Bach to begin to push this in Boston already. We know that there is a tremendous need. Again, we're talking about 86,000 buildings across the city of Boston by the year 2050. Work that can't be outsourced, should be good, high-paying jobs with benefits, and we need to make sure that that workforce reflects Boston. The city of Philadelphia has created a program where young people returning from incarceration, those who are transitioning into a different workforce are able to access this public training program where they are paired with necessary infrastructure projects that are needed right in the community. And once you're trained, once you're part of it, then you can go off and start your own business and make sure that you're taking full advantage of the opportunities there as well. And so our urban conservation course should really tie together the ability to accelerate this work, to create economic opportunity, and to make sure that it is equitable throughout our communities most of all. And then on the financing side, we really need to change a lot of ways of how we are requiring payment for these infrastructure projects and who bears the burden. In many of our larger projects, for example, how we fund water and sewer infrastructure is through what we call betterment. The city pays for the cost up front, and then on everyone's water bill stretched out over a very long period of time, say 15, 20 years, there are small payments made back to make sure that the residents are able to benefit immediately, but afford and can equitably share in the construction of this new infrastructure. There are ways in which the city of Boston should be accessing federal funds so that we are getting our share of the pie and doing this right now without any burden on our residents. And then for individual projects that will require some sort of sharing with individual homeowners, we need to be putting in place programs like this that remove that upfront burden and make it completely possible for our residents to plug in right away. And then the last thing I would say on financing is it needs to be about ownership. Right? When we install new solar on homes, when we think about creating new capacity in wind or building out our microgrid, that energy, the selling it back to the grid, those benefits should come back to our residents, and we should be democratizing ownership of these energy sources so that our residents, again, can share, build wealth locally, and not fuel a corporatization of the green infrastructure changes that we need. So by connecting all those pieces, that's how we ensure that everyone benefits from green infrastructure and that we're actually using it to stop displacement, not accelerate it.
Thank you, Michelle. Jon Santiago.
Thank you, Lokita, for the question, for the work you do in the neighborhood. I mean, you're absolutely correct. I mean, development remains one of the most potent emitters in our city, and right now, given the hundreds of millions of dollars that are bound to come to our city, we have an opportunity to rectify that, to really invest in technology and in funds and in programs to make sure that we are planning for a cleaner future, right? And this is an area, I'll be honest with you, as a state representative, on city issues, I wasn't initially involved in it, but I got involved because my neighborhood needed representation, they needed a voice, and they wanted their elected officials to stand up. So I got involved, and I was happy that during my first year in office, I saw an opportunity in a project really to expand green space in the heart of my neighborhood and to really stop fossil fuel infrastructure. And we did that, by partnering with neighborhood leaders, with stakeholders, with constituents, and even with the developers to make things more efficient and to provide more green space. And I'm proud of that. And as mayor, I mean, you have my commitment that one of my top environmental priorities will be to get us to net zero building emissions by 2035, And I think we look at, the new development, but also the existing development, which, as has been said here on this call, is made up 70+% of our emissions here. When it comes to new development, I do think that we need to be moving forward towards, incentivizing the usage of sustainable building materials. We need to get developers building the types of buildings that we know are best for the environment. We need to promote high efficiency infrastructure, and we need to make sure that we are planning for the green electric grid. We need to get developers in that mindset and incentivize them to do just that. So I'm committed to working with all stakeholders, all across, from developers to the constituents, the activists and advocates, just like yourself, to get us to that green power grid by installing things like solar panels, especially, any city building, municipal building that goes up, solar panels and heat pump systems, they're going to be efficient, that are going to push us away from a fossil fuel infrastructure that we know is continuing to harm our city, our most vulnerable communities in the city of Boston. And when it comes to existing buildings, we have to act with urgency because right now it's making up 70% of our citywide emissions, and we need to move with urgency because we just can't wait. And so prioritize retrofitting them is something that I'll take on from day one. And that's going to be by starting a municipal fund, again, with the hundreds of millions of dollars that are going to be coming down and providing better tax credits to incentivize homeowners and people and renters across the city of Boston that want to go green. We need to prioritize our most vulnerable communities in this fight to make sure that they're not being displaced, that they have access to funds, and that they will be taken care of in the city of Boston. As someone who's dedicated my life to working for and with vulnerable communities, as a state representative, as an emergency room doctor, as a community organizer, I'm committed to doing that from day one.
Great. Thank you, Jon. Annissa.
Thank you, Lokita, for the question. And I spent a few hours a few weeks ago walking the Crane Ledge area, the grounds, and what a beautiful spot, what a beautiful little slice of heaven there on the Mattapan High Park line. And when we think about the work of community, when we think about the need for community to come together, I, as mayor, will continue to lead hand in hand with the residents of our city. And in particular, when we think about the work that's happening in your community, the partnership that was created by a number of High Park and Mattapan neighborhood groups and residents around the Crane Ledge project and area in particular, we see how much we can do when we do it together. I think it's really important that we are continuing to foster those relationships, foster that sense of community, and really grow that network, because we can work together to make sure that we are protecting our urban wilds, that we are protecting our tree canopy, and that we are creating more opportunities for open space and green space in all parts of our city and in every one of our neighborhoods. I think it's really important to continue to demonstrate that as a city and let our neighbors lead in some of these spaces, because for too often we've really let climate action be led by people from outside of our city, when it's so important that our neighborhoods and our neighbors, especially in our more at-risk communities, especially in our communities of color, have that opportunity to lead and to act as it's those neighborhoods, it's our city residents that are on the front line. And certainly together we need to take these proactive steps to protect our environment, to not fuel gentrification, as you mentioned in your question, and to make sure that we are also doing this by really, and I think we have an opportunity here with the federal dollars coming in, especially around infrastructure, to create new opportunities, not just to invest in our current built environment, but to also make sure that we are creating, it's a side conversation that's so important to the larger one that we're having tonight, that we are creating opportunities for our residents across our city to own their own homes. When we create housing ownership opportunities, we are also creating that stable community that then is more invested in a very different way in their neighborhood. But also when we think about those investment dollars coming in from that federal money, we are delivering it to homeowners, we are delivering it directly to community, and we are fixing the built environment so that it can withstand climate change over time. But as it relates directly to Crane's Ledge and the conversation that's happening now in partnership, in community, in collaboration, as one as mayor, we will continue to support, we will continue to do, and continue to work together, because that is how we find the best answers to the problems that we face as a city. Thanks, Lokita, for the question.
Thank you, Annissa. Andrea.
Thank you, Lokita, for the question, and it's great to see you, and thank you for your leadership. But most importantly, you always pushing the city of Boston and others to make sure that not just with respect to retrofitting and gentrification, but that in everything we do in the climate and resiliency space, that we are centering communities of color and making sure that not only are they protected, but that we're not displacing them at the same time. So I appreciate your leadership, specifically on Crane's Ledge. I'm in conversation with a whole host of residents. As you know, I live in Mattapan. Folks are finding me everywhere I go in the neighborhood to talk about this particular project. But I think it's a larger conversation, and I've been asking questions in our current budget hearings around private parcels and what's the role of the city in making sure that private parcels are also being utilized or planned in such a way and utilized that also align with our resiliency and climate goals. So that's not only Crane's Ledge, but so many other parcels as well that often get developed disconnected from the city's larger plan around resiliency. So we'll continue to push the city of Boston to play a greater role and a more significant and meaningful role with respect to some of these private parcels that could be used for urban forestry, different expansion of parks, different roles and different roles. Specifically on your question around retrofitting, gentrification. So this came up quite a bit when I was developing my environmental plan. I spoke to this earlier. A lot of the conversation was just around how the city of Boston has done a poor job over the years of engaging communities of color. of really centering them in the work, of really talking to communities of color, residents of color, around the effects these policies and proposals will have on them. And how do we make sure that every resident, regardless of their income level, regardless of the neighborhood in which they live, that they have access to all the tools that we all probably take for granted? Not just solar panels, of course, the ability to retrofit their homes, the ability to, of course, save money when it comes to energy costs, you name it. And the first thing that I did was begin to think about how do we actually include communities of color in all of these conversations. I was shocked that as a resident of Mattapan, some of our climate maps didn't even include Mattapan. So talk about work that we have to do in the city of Boston to be more inclusive. So specifically on this issue, when we're engaging communities of color, it is about making sure that there are programs and resources available to owners, small landlords, to be able to retrofit homes. That means partnering with the state and the CEC to make sure that there is more funding available for this and other tools in our toolkit. It absolutely, of course, means looking at the federal dollars that are coming into the administration right now. Are there ways in which to create funds that allow residents to have access to some of the energy efficiency upgrades that we're probably all doing in our own homes around more efficient boilers, better insulation, electronic appliances, heating pumps, all of these things? There's a way to create funding around this, and if not, through direct city resources, to partner with the philanthropic community, the private business community, to make this happen. Because if we say we all care about reaching these climate goals in a timely manner, then we're going to have to think about programs that are not just incentives, that are not just low interest loans, but actual grant programs and funding available to folks who desperately need it to be able to participate in these programs. And then lastly, I will say, for me, it's also about jobs. And that comes up quite a bit, of course, in communities of color that desperately need it. And coming out of COVID, we're already seeing a large number of folks in communities of color with higher unemployment rates. And I've been pushing the city of Boston, frankly, right now, to think about how we accelerate some of our capital projects right now as we're sitting on this Zoom, particularly for our own infrastructure or some other projects that may be smaller scale, as a way to create jobs for folks in the community, in communities of color that are losing jobs at rapid rates and continue to. This is something we could be doing right now to move up some of these timelines in a way in which we keep our word when we say we're going to center communities of color, that we actually create opportunities for the residents at the same time. And so retrofitting is one piece of it, but it's a larger conversation around how do we make sure that all residents have access to these incredible programs that are necessary in order for us to reach our climate goals.
Thank you. Jon?
Lokita, thanks for the question. Thanks for your work. For me, there are really four different things I want to touch on. First, I want to talk about the fact that, before I talk about those four things, I want to talk about the fact that there are ways to develop without displacing our neighborhoods. There are practices. As the executive director of the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative for 13 years, we focus on resident leadership and community planning and transformation, and with a specific goal of developing the neighborhood for the people who live there, right? And making sure that we're not developing and then pushing ourselves out for someone else to come. And so that is something that we need to make central to any kind of building we do, particularly retrofitting our homes as we deal with climate justice and environmental justice. So the four things I think that we should focus on: one is financing, and being able to finance these projects and make available. The second is being able to support small businesses so that our local small business can be part of this. The third is being able to support workforce development so that the residents in the city of Boston can be part of this. And then the last one, the fourth I want to touch on, is in fact how we do anti-gentrification work on this. When we think about financing, I want to highlight the work that we did in the city in Boston when we created the Renew Boston Trust. It's a groundbreaking plan to finance energy retrofits. Now, we first used it on municipal buildings to finance a series, 14 in fact, retrofits for City of Boston municipal buildings, using the future energy savings and paying now in cash what we project we will be saving in the future. As part of this work, we retrofitted buildings, and then we took steps as we retrofitted buildings, and I think we should do this with residential buildings, to set the residential buildings up for microgrids that can come in the future. It's important that we're thinking 2-3 steps ahead, not just doing light fixtures and maybe some insulation work, but to make sure that we're setting buildings up so that in fact that they can be part of microgrids moving forward. The second piece around supporting our small businesses, we need to make sure that our local businesses, our women-owned businesses, our the people of color-owned businesses in the city have both the training and the capacity they need to be part of these retrofits, and that they've got the capital that they need to build up. So providing a technical assistance program to help businesses be ready for the retrofits, and then providing the cash so that they can actually have the working capital to engage in the retrofits of our residential buildings or commercial buildings will be really important. And then third, workforce development. We need to continue to fund up workforce development programs and work with partners in the community. I was really proud to work with RCC on their new smart building program. RCC is in fact training people in our community today to make sure that they're part of the new green economy that's coming. At RCC, you can get a building operator training. I think it gives you a level 1 certificate, which is really important. So, and that helps you do commercial buildings. How do we continue to expand what's happening in RCC so that we can do residential buildings and have more training for people in our city so they can be part of this? And then it's clear that we also need to make that part of a larger group of people who are working and building careers in clean energy, in green infrastructure, in environmental education, and more. And then the last piece that I want to talk about is, in fact, anti-gentrification strategies. Three different things that I want to talk about. One is, we know when we do retrofitting of BHA housing, of Boston Housing Authority public housing, when we do the Project Hopes, the Project 6, or any of those new retrofits or remodeling of housing, we lose residents. So we need to set up a resident financial stability fund that allows people to move if they need to and come back. I know when I was doing my house through the Mass Energy Saves program, they were doing some holes in the walls and doing some insulation. Some of that stuff you don't want to be around for. So we might need to put people up in hotels. We might need to put people up in temporary housing, depending on how deep the retrofit is. And we might even need to pay for rent while people are doing that. So we need to make sure that there's financial access, there's access to financial capital for that. And then valuation, taxes. As we improve people's homes, let's not then increase the value of the home and increase their tax bills so that we're displacing them through the tax increases. We need to make sure that the city of Boston is planning ahead of that and providing the right types of tax incentives to keep people in their homes.
Thank you, John. Before we continue to the next question, I just want to remind all those who are here, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and post questions in the chat. We have probably 70 or maybe even 100 questions that have been submitted both on the registration form and the chat, and I can guarantee you we will not get to all of them tonight. We will get to very few. But they will all be saved, and they will be structured, and they will be sent to the candidates, so the candidates will know what other things people are thinking about who were on this call. So I think that you should know that your question is not going to just disappear, but all the candidates will receive it. So I just wanted to let everyone know that. And let's proceed to the next question. Grace Melendez. Grace, would you introduce yourself and ask your question?
Hi, my name is Grace Melendez. I'm here with Corey in the South Street Youth Center. It's a pleasure being here.
Maybe if you can speak a little louder, Grace,
Oh,
if you would.
right.
Thank you.
My name is Grace Melendez. I'm here with Corey Stallings and as well as the South Street Youth Center. It's a pleasure having me here. Thank you. And my question is, what will you do to reduce the unequal impact of climate change and traditional pollution in frontline communities in such areas as heat islands and diesel engine emissions from buses, trucks, and construction equipment? And as well as, what will you do to actively improve the air, such as creating urban forests?
And we will start with John Barros.
Thank you, Grace. Appreciate the question. And so, yeah, no, that very good question. And when you think about our frontline communities, when you think about our EJ communities, I think the first thing that we need to do is make sure that we are engaging and providing capacity building for residents to engage, right? So, resident engagement is going to be really important. Resident education on the issue, and then providing forums for people to continue to engage. Now, there are resident groups out there that are far advanced on the issue, and so how do we support them and continue to support the activism on the ground, continue to support youth groups who are active on this to make sure that the city is working with communities that are ready to engage. The other thing is we need to make sure that, sort of in my neighborhood, there are, many trucks that come through because I'm too close to the expressway and in a light industrial area. And so we had to, as a neighborhood, always call the city when they're either idling on the streets or coming through residential streets that they're not supposed to. And so part of that is having a plan and being able then to communicate to that plan, because a lot of these trucks and the big diesel sort of construction vehicles, it needs us to pay attention to them. It needs monitoring. It needs us to communicate that it's not acceptable for you to be idling, whether it's on construction sites or people that are coming to deliver goods in our neighborhoods. It's also about the businesses that are in our neighborhoods that do, really toxic or dangerous work. Spent a long time working with trash transfer stations in my neighborhood to make sure that those businesses were using the best practices to keep us healthy. And in fact, some of those emissions weren't healthy. And during the really hot summer days, you can smell the garbage. You can smell the stuff in my neighborhood. And so we had to work with them to bring better practices to those businesses to make sure that those businesses can survive and those jobs can survive, but that residents can survive and that we weren't recipients of really bad quality of air. And so these are the things that we need to do to work with those who are operating in our communities, whether through construction or whether they're transporting things or actually conducting business in our neighborhoods to make sure that they're doing it right. But the city needs to lay down a legal framework, a regulatory framework, then that holds people accountable on all of those things that we work with the neighborhoods on, so that in fact there's teeth and there's accountability in terms of how people operate.
Thank you, John. Andrea.
Let's get off mute, Bob.
Oh,
Grace,
no.
hi.
Oh, yes, okay. Go ahead, Andrea.
No, thank you. Hi, Grace, you're down here on my screen, but great to see you, and thank you for the question. And thank you, frankly, for centering communities of color, right, in this conversation, because that is critical. And I often say we are not going to be successful in the climate justice movement if we do not include communities of color, if we do not center them, if we do not engage them and exercise an incredible intentionality and sense of urgency with responding to the issues that show up in those communities, including, as you had said, air pollution, higher rates of asthma, of course, lack of transportation deserts, lack of green space, the list is long. So I appreciate your framing, Grace. I actually have felt this not just because I'm a Black woman, a beautiful Black woman, but I've also felt this growing up in Roxbury, where today Roxbury still has some of the highest asthma rates in the Commonwealth. I live in Mattapan now with my two beautiful boys. And as I mentioned earlier, we are experiencing, of course, greater effects of climate, but the fact that on certain climate maps, my neighborhood of Mattapan wasn't included really speaks volumes about the work that continues to need to be done to center communities of color. And there's a way in which to do this where every neighborhood feels a part of the solution. Every neighborhood feels a part of the movement to make sure that Boston truly is the leader in addressing issues of climate and the environmental and justice issues that affect all of us. And I was really proud as a councilor representing largely a district of color to be at Franklin Park Public Housing planting trees, to be pushing for the Boston Housing Authority to do better with respect to waste reduction, composting, recycling. We still have a lot more work to do with respect to our Boston Housing Authority buildings. Was really proud as a counselor to be pushing for much of this to happen. I'm really proud that as a counselor, I started the vacant lot initiative as a way to push the city of Boston to activate city-owned parcels for green space, to expand access to green space in parts of the city of Boston, particularly in communities of color. For housing, of course, but housing and homeownership opportunities that were designed, of course, to help folks move into housing that had everything you would need in order to face any climate issue that would come into your community. Pushing the city of Boston to make sure that everything we did was not only through a racial equity lens, but through a resiliency lens, so that when the next pandemic comes, every neighborhood is prepared. And we know that right now in the city of Boston, some neighborhoods are still not prepared with respect to resiliency. So proud of that work as a counselor. I have a record of accomplishment that would demonstrate that I would continue to center communities of color in this work going forward. And for me, that means, one, tracking information and data. It's really important that we collect metrics and that we respond with policy that includes those metrics. So for example, air pollution, we should have our health commission or department in the city of Boston tracking these metrics every single day, getting a sense of what these environmental health metrics are in the city of Boston, in every neighborhood, the exposure to lead, airborne particles in a community, pollution in low-income communities, and then of course, developing solutions, policy, legislation that's responsive to that. The second piece is, and this is not my words, I had a lot of folks inform my environmental plan, including communities of color, generate green dividends for residents. I didn't even know what that meant before I was developing my plan. And what it really means is really looking at all of the money that the federal government and the state is pouring into these efforts. How do we make sure that residents in these communities have direct investments made in their communities, that we're addressing the health effects, that we're addressing the economic effects, that we're bringing in jobs. We might have to bring in direct payments, particularly for retrofitting and other things that folks would need. Talking about the jobs, that's the third piece. Green economy, clean energy is the future. It's jobs now, but jobs of the future. How are we training our young people in Boston Public Schools to have access to these jobs? We need to do better in terms of skill development. How are we working with our unions to create more opportunities? How are we right now accelerating some of the capital projects in the city of Boston to create these jobs right now for folks who are struggling in the midst of COVID? And lastly, and I could go on and on, but we don't have much time, but lastly, how do we expand access to parks, green space, expand our tree canopy? We've been talking about it for a really long time. Attach timelines, accountability to make it happen. I would continue to exercise that leadership, not only now, but if I'm blessed to become the next elected mayor. So thank you, Grace, for your question and for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks. Grace, as you know and mentioned in your question, environmental justice is about the big and the small stuff. It's big policy planning initiatives and smaller actions that are never insignificant. Our climate action must begin with frontline communities whose health and safety is most at risk, especially our communities of color and lower income communities. We need to always be taking proactive steps to address the real, everyday environmental injustices. We need to mitigate how noise and air pollution affects our residents living under flight paths, for example. When I was a teacher at East Boston High School, I coached softball, and one of the fields we practiced at all day long, we'd be looking at I like to call it the ass end of an airplane, but you know what the fumes and the fuel and the air, the terrible effects that has when we think about what's happening on that back end of an airplane. We have to protect our coastal neighborhoods from sea level rising and flooding. We see that not just every full moon or blue moon here in Dorchester along the coastline, but we see how it impacts our inner communities as well. We have to improve public transit to encourage ridership and reduce greenhouse emissions. We have to grow our tree canopy. As you mentioned, the urban wilds in particular play such an important role in our neighborhoods across our city, and certainly help with the heat island effect that we see across our city. And we absolutely need to create opportunities to do some public outreach to our communities at large around education, but also work with our students across the Boston Public Schools in particular, and develop curriculum to help better educate our kids, whether it's through elementary education or environmental sciences at the AP level in high school, but making sure that there's educational opportunities in between that early earth science and the opportunity for advanced placement in environmental science in high school. As mayor, I have a number of priorities, but we certainly will center those frontline communities in climate and other policy conversations, because too many of those conversations are happening around those that are most impacted by climate injustice. We need to make sure that we are truly investing in the green economy and the workforce. I see very directly that that happens through Madison Park Vocational Technical High School. We have an incredible opportunity to respond to the changes that need to happen, but we can't do it without a workforce, and that workforce can be trained through our own schools and through Madison Park in particular, both during the day for our young people and in the afternoon and in the evenings to retrain, to upskill our adult workforce and others who want to participate in that training. And then, we've gone back to, this work that is left undone with retrofitting and rebuilding and making sure that our current infrastructure, our current built environment is responsible to our climate needs across the city. Grace, thank you very much for the question, and thank you for your interest in this subject matter. We need our young people engaged in these conversations.
John?
Thank you, Grace, for the question, and I'll echo what Annissa just said. Thank you for your involvement, for your engagement. We need young people leading this, and we need to be listening to young people who are in the trenches, who are the next generation of leaders. And as someone who grew up in underserved neighborhoods and today still provides medical care to patients who have fallen victim to the public health consequences of environmental injustice, this issue is quite personal to me. The problems caused by things like air pollution, unhealthy living conditions, unsafe water, they will manifest in my emergency room, and COVID has made that worse for anyone who was paying attention, right? For example, one of the reasons we saw such a higher hospitalization and death rate in our Black and Latino communities was because they were more likely to have comorbidities, things like asthma, because they were more likely to live in neighborhoods more impacted by pollution, And I saw this day in, day out during COVID, pre-COVID, and I still see it in the emergency room today, right? That's why as mayor, Grace, I'm going to prioritize equity in everything I do, and that starts with environmental injustice, because we need to make sure that their voices are centered, right? And they must be at the table with any infrastructure development that we're talking about that's going on in their respective neighborhoods. So when it comes to EJ, environmental justice issues in their communities, I'll commit to the following. I'll incentivize, sustainable infrastructure investments in those communities. I want to prioritize their voices, their inclusion in any development that happens in their community, because they need to be a part of it. Now, I'm proud of my work at the State House this past year to make sure that EJ was finally codified in state law. But to me, it also means including that they have an opportunity to play in the new green workforce. Grace, I want to give you an opportunity to study STEM, to study, with the new technologies that are going to be boundless, that are going to help us turn our society into a greener place, And, the questions you bring up with respect to diesel and trees, I couldn't agree with you more. I want to convert to make our vacant city lots. I want to make sure that we have more green spaces, that we have more trees. Because look, I live a block away from a heat island, on Melendez Cass, and if it wasn't for the residents that stood up, that got to work, and that made sure that we were going to protect those trees, I'm glad for what they did, And we're not going to get to, our 2030 canopy goal. I think Mayor Menino wanted 100,000 trees by 2020, Walsh by 2030. We're not there yet. I think our canopy is about 27%. We want to get to 35%, but it's more than just planting trees. I read somewhere that we plant trees, 15 to 20% of those trees within the first year die away from a lack of investment. We need to make sure that if we plant trees, that we're investing in them, and I'm committed to doing that. And when it comes to diesel, listen, we need to fight for a greener transportation system. We need to expand transit opportunities. We need to incentivize bike and micromobility. And as someone who doesn't own a car, who takes the T, who rides bus 43, who rides his bike to go to the hospital and to go to the State House, I'm committed to doing that.
Thank you, John. Michelle?
Thank you. Thank you, Grace, so much for not just bringing up this issue, but being here to make sure that it got asked. I think about our young people all across the city when we talk about climate, and it is this exact issue that's on people's minds. I remember standing in Chinatown a couple years ago when we were calling a press conference to announce that a major study had been done about air pollution all across Massachusetts. And it was right there on the basketball courts at the Josiah Quincy Upper School, where we send our young people out to exercise every day, that residents in that community were breathing the most polluted air anywhere in Massachusetts. You looked up from there and you could see the highways crammed with trucks, with cars, stuck in traffic, spewing that dangerous pollution up into the air. It's the same story in East Boston, where I hear from so many families that they know when they're out in the playgrounds, they know that smell. And as soon as the wind changes and you smell that smell, you have to take your kids inside because the pollution from the jet fuel is so toxic, so strong that it can cause immediate health impacts, much less the harm that goes into asthma, heart conditions way down the line. And we know we were in Roxbury with residents who had to call a press conference threatening to tie themselves to the trees to protect them because the city of Boston was threatening to implement a plan for 10 years that the community had been fighting to make people choose between having better transportation infrastructure or the trees that were life-saving and necessary in an urban heat island to cool down the air, to absorb pollution, and to provide the beauty of Mother Nature right there. And so we see this all across Boston. We need city leadership who's going to step up and make sure that this is urgent. So this is what I propose that we all do, and that I propose to do in coalition as the next mayor. We need to fight together for all the levels of government and all the organizations that we should stand up for Boston with, whether it is Eversource, as they are threatening, as they are continuing their push to site an unjust electrical substation in a residential community, in a floodplain, where the neighborhood is already bearing the environmental injustices of the entire region. Whether it is the MBTA and pushing so that we can stop traffic and actually give people other options by investing in public transportation that's reliable, accessible, connects people where they need to go, and is free like every other public good. Or whether it is making sure that we are standing up to the airport. A huge, huge fan. I will go anywhere that Mothers Out Front is organizing, and especially in East Boston, Mothers Out Front has been making sure that we are fighting to install HEPA filters to clean the air in all of our schools in East Boston and all of our public spaces and civic buildings. The airport should directly be involved, and that their mitigation should pay for the harm that they are causing. We also need a mayor who's going to do what we can do within city power now. So when you talk about diesel pollution, 60% of the diesel fuel that is used by the city of Boston is connected to the very young people I've been talking about. Our school buses, we have 700 buses, yellow school buses that carry our 24,000 students who need that bus service. And more than half of them, just about half of them, are still diesel buses. That's 5 to 10 times the pollution that's spewed. Kids are breathing in as they're riding to school where they need to be their fullest selves and grow and learn. We have to transition right away to electric buses, and that will help us build out our capacity to plug into the electric grid as well. We also need to make sure that we are planting those trees wherever we can and putting in rules so that we don't have to play whack-a-mole one situation after another. Because just as we saved those 200 trees on Melendez Boulevard, overnight, the city of Boston cut down trees right down the road, pretty close by in a public housing development that there was no notice, no meetings, and it was just devastating to see the harm that had caused. So we need to be proactive, not chasing that situation, but planting more trees, committing to tens of thousands of new trees, as well as stopping cutting down of the trees that we currently have on our streets and on private property. And most of all, we need to make sure that we are centering jobs and connecting our local economy in every way possible. I think our food systems are a huge way to do this. I'm proud of writing legislation that made Boston the first city on the East Coast to implement good food purchasing. It's a food justice plan that ties these requirements into any way that we are spending money on food, mostly through Boston Public School lunches, but we can set the tone in the city of Boston when we preference food that is locally grown, healthy and nutritious, that comes from fair labor all along the food supply chain, that ensures that we are respecting, centering animal welfare, that ensures that we are following environmental sustainability, and that we are centering racial equity in how we give out those contracts to vendors and sub-vendors. Imagine if Boston partnered with all of our other sectors who are serving food, not just the city and our schools, but colleges, universities, hospitals serving patients and visitors. That's $100 million of local jobs that we could be connecting to a safer, cleaner, healthier environment for everyone in our city.
Thank you, Michelle. We are, of course, running over our scheduled time. No surprise there. To help try to keep us as close as we can, we may try to run it over maybe 5 minutes, no more than that. But if we, just for the last two questions, I would encourage all of you candidates to be as brief as you can while still communicating what you need to communicate. Our next questioner is Alex James. Please introduce yourself, Alex, and ask your question.
Hi, everyone. Thank you to all the candidates who's joining us. Thank you to everyone watching. My name is Alex. I'm an organizer with the Boston Cyclists Union. We're an organization that works to make our streets safer and more equitable and greener for everyone in the city. As we all know, one of the biggest sources of emissions in Boston and nationwide is transportation. And making our transportation greener is key to fighting the climate crisis. Personally, I live in Brighton, and like a lot of people here in Allston-Brighton, and a lot of people here in Boston, I don't own a car, so I really rely on public transportation and on my bike to move around the city and to access the parts of Boston that I need to access in order to live my life. So what I want to know is, what are you going to do as mayor to build out more rapid bus lanes and a network of safe, connected, and low-stress bike lanes?
Michelle.
Thank you so much, Alex. I count myself as a proud member of the community as well, and really am grateful to so many friends and advocates in the cycling community for making it so that I could feel safe riding a bike and getting back on two wheels after so long of a break since my childhood. This has been a major place of advocacy for me. We know that, as you said, it's the second largest source of emissions, and it's also a matter of life and death for far too many. Boston is a city with tremendous opportunity, but when you map where the problem spots are, where there are constant crashes, where there are constant calls about near crashes, it is all too often in communities of color. It is all too often the same locations. And so we need to commit to streets for people, and we need to commit to safety for every mode of transportation, every road user. When it comes to our dedicated bus lanes, we can't move fast enough on this. I'm really proud to have advocated for the city's first dedicated bus lane running in Rosendale from Rosendale Square to Forest Hill Station, which has been transformational, life-changing for so many residents in my neighborhood. But we still, all these years later, only have one direction going inbound in the morning, and we need to make sure that we are not just finishing this part, but going through the entire mapping of the dozen corridors that the MBTA laid out for the city of Boston in 2016, telling us these are the places where it would make a difference for traffic and congestion, for mobility, for health, to immediately implement bus rapid transit. Other cities have been paving the way. The city of Everett, for goodness sakes, has been modeling a faster implementation of dedicated bus lanes than Boston. And it's one and the same when it comes to how we think about our cycling infrastructure as well. One of the preeminent experts in the country is based right here. Shout out to Professor Peter Firth, who joined us for a council briefing series on transportation, and specifically explained how and where we could close up holes in this low stress cycling network. He's mapped out the entire city for us with his students. We just need to implement this. We need to bring more design and engineering in-house, avoiding the long protracted timelines and the extraordinary costs of bidding out everything and having all design go out to consultants to do. We need to make sure that we're coordinating projects. So anytime a road is opened up for any reason, laying new internet or fixing the pipes or just resurfacing, that there's an automatic commitment to complete streets and adding safe infrastructure as it's put back together. And most of all, we need to commit to using this moment. It is a tremendous opportunity with federal funds available, not just for our recovery, but federal funds available to take down and repair mistakes of the past. Just this morning, I was out with advocates, including Fred Salvucci at the Alston interchange, where we need city leadership to push back and say the state should not double down on the failed strategies of the past, using highway infrastructure to divide communities. Between that, the red-blue connector, rapid transit on the Fairmount line, there are major infrastructure projects that we can complement the day-to-day street level infrastructure that we should be rolling out all throughout our recovery. Now is the time to do it. We have to be bold, we have to do more, and doing so will unlock opportunity and mobility across all of the city of Boston.
Thank you, Michelle. Jon Santiago.
Great. I realize we have about 5 minutes left, so I'll try to be brief here. Alex, thank you for the question. Count me there in solidarity with you as someone who also doesn't own a car, who takes bus 43, who rides a bike, who actually has been hit by a car while riding a bike. And so I know what that feels like. And not only my experience being hit by a car, but as someone who's treated countless of people who've been struck, pedestrians or people cycling and the emergency department. To me, that's one of the scariest experiences I have, when people come to the ER when they've been struck by a car. But you're absolutely right, Alex. Transit equity and access is a public health issue. It's an economic issue, and it is absolutely an environmental issue. Aside from development, as you said, it is the top emitter of pollution. And that's why I've been a staunch supporter of increasing MBTA funding at the State House. In fact, the last vote we took, Alex, was in the State House before COVID-19 struck, was for a $600 million investment into the MBTA. And I would fathom if it wasn't for COVID-19, the Senate would have got a bill done, would have gone to the governor's desk, we would have veto proof, and we would have invested hundreds of millions of more dollars into our system, which desperately needs it. And so I've been a longtime believer in increased transportation funding, and I fought back cuts, whether that was on Beacon Hill, during MBTA hearings, or alongside my community, really, who, when MBTA tried to stop the one major bus that goes through my community, bus 43, I galvanized the community to stop that. And so they never touched it, But, what we need to do, in my opinion, what I'll do as mayor is to increase accessibility. We need to improve interconnectivity, affordability, and reliability across every transportation medium. We need dedicated bus lanes, as you said, and we need safe biking lanes. And as someone who, as I said, who takes the bike and, all across the city of Boston, I'm very much committed to making sure that my, way across the city of Boston is made easier and safer, particularly if you want to really, create a swift economic recovery to Boston. So I'll continue to advocate for the expansion of public health transit and decrease costs and barriers to people who want to take the bus, And let's not forget about the role development plays. I want to invest in transit-oriented development housing. We need to incentivize people taking the T, and I'm committed to doing that. We need folks riding the T, biking, increasing access to micromobility ways. And as the next mayor of Boston who's going to ride his bike to City Hall, I'm committed to doing that.
Okay, thank you, Jon. Annissa.
Thanks, Alex, for the question. We know that our climate response needs to be rooted in transit. We also know that nearly a third of Boston's total carbon emissions come from transportation, and 65% of those comes from personal vehicles. We've made progress with the city's zero emissions vehicle roadmap and installing publicly accessible electric vehicle charging stations, but we know we can do more. We need to go bold together with our partners at the state to meet the climate and transit crisis with a regional response. It has to be a regional response. As mayor, I will build a transit task force with experts, advocates, stakeholders, and community members to push the state to expand its electric bus fleet, to modernize the commuter rail by adopting electric operations, improve and invest in public transit so we can get people out of their cars and onto our trains, buses, bike lanes, and sidewalks, and making sure that we're doing that safely. We need to expand the city's electrical vehicle charging program, and certainly, as mentioned before, electrify our school bus fleet and make sure that our city's vehicles, the city's cars that are used for city business, are also all electrical. And that's really an important part of some of the things that we can do, but certainly the conversation around expanding dedicated bus lanes and making sure that our rails and the way that any one of our residents moves to get from point A to point B is as seamless as possible, as easy as possible, and that the timing works out, that we aren't cutting service on our rail lines, especially those that service our lower income communities, and that we are, and I've done this on the council, advocated to make sure that we are building that north-south rail link. I will continue to do that work as mayor of the city of Boston.
Thank you. Andrea?
Thank you, Bob. And of course, thank you, Alex, for the question. The Cyclists Union and so many of the transit advocates over the years for their advocacy. We've worked in partnership on a whole host of issues in my district because I have major corridors like Blue Hill Ave, Washington Street, American Legion Highway. And we've seen some successes, whether it's dedicated bus lanes in certain parts, of course, of Rosendale, infrastructure changes that are happening right now, major projects on American Legion Highway, slow streets projects in my district, many of them. So have seen some successes, but I think for me, there's also been a whole host of frustrations. And I have been at numerous Boston Transportation and Public Works budget hearings speaking to that frustration, at one point even suggesting that maybe I had to go out and build speed humps by myself because we weren't keeping up to date with the concerns and the complaints we were hearing from residents with respect to what we needed to do as a city to protect folks on their bike, walking, all of that, of course, but also to make sure that we were creating safe streets in such a way that anyone walking down the street would feel safe, anyone biking down the street would feel safe, and that currently isn't the reality. So I have been a fierce advocate on many of these issues. One of the reasons I jumped into this mayor's race back in September was the inaction on a whole host of issues, particularly with respect to transportation. So in my plan, I'm really proud that one, it's specific. It's not ridiculously long, so I encourage folks to read it because it really does have specific things in there that the city of Boston could do to improve our transportation infrastructure for everyone and close transit deserts that also exist in the city of Boston as well, particularly in communities of color. So number one, of course, is pushing the T for greater investment. I call for our buses to be made free, which is one equity initiative I think we can make actually happen in the city of Boston. There's an appetite at the State House to get that done. There's federal dollars that are also being poured in from the new Transportation Administration on this very issue. It's a small percentage of the MBTA's budget where I think this equity initiative could happen. The second piece is, as we're pushing the state to do their part with respect to the T, how do we as the city of Boston take the lead? And that means infrastructure. I've been calling since the very beginning of COVID for us to recognize that interest rates are low, accelerate capital projects, and do it for some of the transit projects that we have as a way to not only create jobs, but of course to create more dedicated bus lanes right now, as a way, of course, to create more infrastructure and changes to our streets to allow for multimodal transportation, not just for bikes, I should say, for scooters and all kinds of other modes of transportation. So really pushing the city of Boston to have greater investment here, to really push for some of these federal dollars to be immediately invested in some of these infrastructure changes, including for the Slow Streets program, and doing it in such a way that every neighborhood has access, not pitting one neighborhood against another for something we all desperately need. Also, Boston Public Schools plays a critical role. There are a lot of folks who do not know how to ride a bike. There are a lot of folks who don't know the value of getting on a bike for exercise purposes, for convenience. There's a lot we can be doing and investing in our Boston Public Schools to help our young people understand why this is important. There are some incredible programs in the community that already do it, but BPS could be doing more. And then the last piece I think is critically important is also looking at closing gaps where there is transportation deserts. The fact that there are transportation deserts in the city of Boston as we sit on this Zoom is absolutely unacceptable. And that may mean, for example, working with not just those in the philanthropic community, transportation level at the federal government, but of course the state level to push for some of those immediate projects with respect to RT and other infrastructure changes that will allow for folks to get around their neighborhood in a great way. And one last piece, I know, Bob, you probably, I don't know where the timer is. In my plan, I talk about the 15-minute neighborhood. It's not just about how folks get to and from across the city of Boston. How do we commute in our neighborhoods? This conversation around transportation has to be coupled with economic opportunity, economic development, all of these issues are intersectional. And so for me, I really push that in my transportation plan. Thank you.
Okay. John Barros, you get the last word.
Thanks, Bob. I really appreciate it. And thank you, Alex, for the question. And Alex, I recognize that, you asked the question around the mode of transportation, the two modes of transportation that the city has the most control over. And that makes a lot of sense. Being able to prioritize rapid bus lanes in the city and moving people around, and then also being able to prioritize safe bike infrastructure is critical. But also putting them together makes a lot of sense as well, right? So creating a coordinated network of travel. When you look at our biking network as it's designed, and you start to begin to think about how we overlay some of the bus corridors, particularly the bus rapid lanes, and how we can sort of build that out in ways that people can get around the city, and it makes sense. For me, I think that's where I get excited. When I went to Mexico City to watch how they moved 15 million people around on their buses, but then also had the last mile, sort of situation with the van set up. That's something that Boston can do, should be able to do, and do better. Timing, coordinated services, allowing people how it's set up for them to get from point A to point B in a way where it's quickest, most efficient. When I ride my bike up Columbia Road, that is a serious ride. But when I'm biking in Boston, as opposed to thinking about how do you bike or take the bus when you need to take the bus, and then bike the next part of it, right? And keep it safe. And I think that we need to do more of that in a way that it makes sense for the city of Boston. As mayor, I would be committed, in fact, to work with the community to add more bus rapid transit. I would be committed to add more safe biking infrastructure where it made sense, but more importantly, coordinate the two so that it could be something that we do in a way that people use it, thinking about how to get across the city, go to jobs, go to leisure, go to play, go to meet family, etc. But I also think that we need to take this opportunity with this historic infrastructure bill that Biden's putting out and begin to electrify rapid transit, particularly on our commuter lines. We've got, and I've been fighting, since I was really young for improvements around the Fairmont line, which is a line that goes through some of Boston's most low-income neighborhoods. And we've gotten pieces here and there. I'm proud of some of the most recent improvements that we've seen. I remember when we actually had to start that line again. They stopped service. That was a while back. But now we're getting better and better service. Well, this is an opportunity for Boston to go in and make that a clean, electrified, rapid transit line that connects people. And then maybe there's a whole new transit station in Wadette in a way that allows the Fairmont to connect to the Needham, that connects to track 61 that heads us into the South Boston waterfront. But then we think about sort of bus rapid as it connects to those, and then even the bike lanes as it connects to those, in the way that we have a system that works. I think that's how Boston needs to think about this, and then work with the state to create some coordination and efficiencies in our system that we haven't seen. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We did have another question. We are not going to have time to do that. I just want to introduce Mary Brady. Why don't you just say what your question was, Mary? You're muted, Mary. There you go.
I'm Mary Brady from Jamaica Plain, Mothers Out Front. I'm going to have to pretty much yell to ask the question because one of our fossil fuel utility companies is outside my window on our street for about the 8th time since December trying to fix something that they can't figure out how to fix. So excuse me for yelling at you. Don't take it personally. The question has to do with something you've all alluded to, but we were going to ask you to go more in depth. What will you do to create those green infrastructure jobs, and who will you prioritize to fill them?
Thank you, Mary. I'm sorry we won't get to answer that. And there's one or two more I'm just going to mention. There's a question about how you would support and implement the Boston Energy Reporting System and the Boston building standards. Those are both issues that will come before the City Council, which is relevant for most of you. Well, 3 of you anyway. So that will be on the list of questions that you get, and we're going to put it near the top. We all think that's a very important issue to be addressed in a vigorous way by the city council and the mayor, because it's what these, for those who are not familiar with it, these are two ordinances that would control and reduce the amount of emissions from the many buildings in Boston. And initially it both monitors and in the long run will reduce. And we also had one other question just for you to think about that I thought was an interesting one. Would you support an ordinance that would require homeowners and business owners to get a permit before they cut down a mature tree? So I don't expect anyone to answer it at this late hour, but that's an interesting question, and controlling public property alone may not be enough. All right, a couple more things here before we finish. We were going to give you all a few minutes to talk as summary at the end, but I'm afraid we don't have time for that. But you all have laid out what you think about very well, so I think that'll be fine. I would just like to read off a few thank yous here, if I may, before we close. First, I want to thank the 5 candidates who are here for taking the time to speak with this community and about these crucial issues of climate and climate justice. And we hope that they will be a centerpiece on the agenda of whoever is the next mayor. And then we want to thank also the questioners who stepped up to ask these questions. Corey, Grace, Lokita, Alex, and Mary was at least willing to. So we appreciate that. And also want to thank 2 people, Frank O'Brien and Mike Prokosh, who did an enormous amount of outreach to many of our community organizations to get them on board with this. They did a great job. And also want to thank Sarah Bridgette and Ed Campbell. They're both from Resonant Energy in Dorchester, for those of you who are familiar with that asset to our community, for doing the flyer that was used to publicize this event. And I want to thank also Michelle Brooks and Kurt Newton for their social media outreach on Twitter and Facebook, respectively, and Laura Sparks for her outreach to the traditional community print media that we have in the city. So, and I especially want to thank Mary Brady, who was just on here a moment ago. She was Mary, you were a tremendous help on so many things. So I really appreciate that so much. And that concludes our forum. I especially want to thank, of course, all of you who tuned in. And many of you managed to stick it out through the whole thing, a significant majority, which is great. You took up the time, even when we ran over a little bit. Thank you. Thanks to all of you, to Jon and Annissa and Andrea and Michelle for taking the time to talk with us tonight. It was great. It was lovely having you, and I think it was very informative, and the city is better off for us all having had the chance and the opportunity to hear you speak on these issues. So thank you, and good night to both all of you on the screen as well as all of you who attended. One more thanks for the technical staff before we go. Sam Payne from 350 Mass, who took the time to do this, and Rob Kipp, who helped him make all the technology for this work extremely smoothly. And those of you who attended will get a follow-up email from us telling where you can access the recording and maybe some other information that'll come out in the next week or so. Good night, everybody.